the next is our last pre-recorded session. It's from Gregory Noonan, who's the new acting director of the FDA at the Office of Dietary Supplements. He's going to talk about probiotics under the framework of DSHEA and the new dietary ingredient guidelines, where we're headed with that. We're waiting for commentary from that. And then we're going to jump into the session with IPA Europe.
Hi, I'm Greg Noonan. I'm currently the Acting Deputy Director at the Office of Dietary Supplement Programs. And I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak or record today. And hopefully next year, we'll be able to do this in person. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the FDA's role in dietary supplement regulation. Because that's actually a really broad topic, decided to focus a little bit on describing some of where our authorities come from, as well as focusing a little bit on the pre-market side of things. I think that's probably the most important and perhaps the most interesting. It's the area that I work in the most. So before I get into the nuts and bolts of supplement regulation, I thought it might be a good idea to give sort of a overview of how supplements are structured within the FDA organizational setting. So the FDA has 7 centers. I have 6 of them shown here at this point. There are the sort of product-specific centers such as drugs, devices, and biologics. Then there's also the Office of Regulatory Affairs, which does a lot of runs the field labs, does the testing, deals a lot with imports and inspections. And ORA works across all of the centers to sort of set up these procedures, and there's a lot of interaction there. So in the US, as many of you may know, supplements are considered foods. That's how they're regulated, so they fall within the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Now, we work pretty closely with our colleagues in the Office of Regulatory Affairs, but also quite regularly with our colleagues in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, especially their botanical drugs team. There's a lot of interaction, a lot of crosstalk there on those types of products and ingredients. Within CIFSAN, we are divided into a number of different what we call program offices, depending on the sort of regulatory push. So there's the Office of Food Additive Safety and Office of Colors and Cosmetics that deal with those particular commodities or areas. And of course, the Office of Dietary Supplement Programs is the lead on dietary supplement regulation within CIFSAN and then also within the FDA. Now, ODSP is actually a fairly new office. It was split out a little over 5, maybe 6 years ago into its own office. And it's, I think, sort of medium-sized. We have a little over 30 people. We recently went through a reorganization, and we're expanding at this point in time, which we're very excited about. We've currently now divided into 2 different divisions. The Division of Policy and Regulations Implementation deals a lot with the sort of post-market side of things. They deal with our compliance efforts. They deal with commenting on legislation and really important aspects. They do have some pre-market aspects, but a lot of theirs is sort of preparation and post-market. While the Division of Research and Evaluation deals greatly in sort of the pre-market area, and specifically the new dietary ingredient notification area that I'm going to talk more about today. So now that perhaps you'll have a little bit of a feel for the structure of FDA and even ODSP, I want to get into where our specific authorities come from in regulating dietary supplements, and in this case, probiotics or live microbials. So the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is sort of the major legislation that deals with the majority of FDA commodities. And specifically, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, or DSHEA, which was passed in 1994, was the first regulation to really target dietary supplements and talk about dietary supplements. And it did a number of major things. First, perhaps and foremost, it actually set the definition of the term dietary supplement. It also set up this pre-market review or new dietary ingredient notification review that I'm going to talk about some more. It authorized the adulteration provisions, and again, food is how those provisions work with dietary supplements. It also gave authority for some GMPs. There are some additional acts which come into play, and I'll just mention them here. I will not get into them much today. The Dietary Supplement Non-Prescription Drug Consumer Protection Act set up a reporting for serious adverse events. And then the Bioterrorism Act of 2002 and followed on by the Food Safety Modernization Act more recently sort of set up facility registration, the need to renew these registrations, as well as some other requirements. But again, much of that is a sort of post-market, and I'm going to try to focus a little bit more on the pre-market. So getting back to this DSHEA and specifically the definition of the term dietary supplement. This is sort of the foundation of how ODSP works and how our notification program works. It's really important. So a dietary supplement is a product other than tobacco that is intended to supplement the diet. So if we think about meal replacement plans or even beverages that may be 16 or a liter or half a liter in size, those generally don't fall into the supplement range. Those are considered foods because they're not simply supplementing the diet. They are part of a meal or a meal. The product must be intended for ingestion, so inhalation or absorption either on the skin or sublingual does not fall into the definition of a dietary supplement. And then it must contain one or more dietary ingredients. And there's a list of ingredients, things that are considered dietary ingredients that I have here that are actually in DSHEA: vitamin, mineral, herb, or botanical, amino acid. Then there's a sort of broader dietary substance for use by man to supplement the diet by increasing the total dietary intake. So if we had something, maybe fish oil is a great example here, that is commonly eaten as a part of a food. It's part of the diet. It's also now considered a supplement, even though it doesn't fall in any of those other sort of four categories. And then finally, to sort of encompass all of them, a concentrate, metabolite, constituent, extract, or combination of any of the above dietary ingredients. So as long as you have one of these, you're a dietary ingredient. In some cases, you often have more than one. I want to take a little bit closer look at the dietary substance for use by man. This is where sort of most of the live microbials or probiotics sort of fall into this category or part of the definition. So just focusing a little bit more closely on that. So a bacterial microorganism is a dietary ingredient if it is a dietary substance that is an intentional constituent of food. So we think of things used in fermentation for cheese or fermentation for yogurt or even yeast. These are bacterial microorganisms that are intended to be there. They play a role, and so they are a dietary substance and then considered a dietary ingredient. And I will say, in just a note here, and I'll get a little bit more into this later, is that within the U.S. we deal at the strain level. So I think in some other regulatory environments, there's a combination of a species strain, but when we talk about dietary ingredients, we are focusing on the strain when we do our reviews. So a bacteria that's never been consumed as a food are likely to be dietary ingredients. However, the mere presence in food does not mean that it falls into a dietary ingredient. Perhaps the best example of this is pathogenic bacteria. Clearly, we eat salmonella, but again, clearly it's not supposed to be there, so it's not really an intentional constituent of food. So now that we've got some feel in general and even in a sort of probiotic area of what we consider a dietary ingredient, I want to go back a little bit to the definition because there's some other things from DSHEA that distinguish it, supplements, especially distinguishing them from drugs. So there is this exclusion in DSHEA, so dietary supplements do not include certain drug ingredients. There are a lot of details around that. I don't think it's critical for today, but I just wanted to mention that. Additionally, a dietary supplement may not claim to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease. There are some exceptions for this if we're talking about nutritional deficiencies or qualified health claims. But in the case of a probiotic, if it actually claimed to diagnose or cure a disease, it would actually be regulated under the biologics and not as a supplement. So that's a very important distinction. Supplements, as well as drugs, can make what are called structure or function claims, so affect the structure or function of the body. And the DPRI, the other division within ODSP, spends a good deal of time reviewing these structure function claims. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, dietary supplement products do not undergo a pre-market approval process. And I think the real key word there is approval. There is a pre-market review process for some supplement products or some ingredients, but it is not a approval process. So try to give some background on sort of the definition of a supplement. It was one of the major things that DSHEA did. The other thing it did is it set up this new dietary ingredient notification process, which again establishes a requirement that 75 days prior to marketing, if you have a new manufacturer has a new dietary ingredient, they need to notify the FDA of entering it into the market. It also set up some specific requirements, which I'll go into. They're not extensive, but they are sort of important in the review process. And again, I want to emphasize here, this is not an approval process, but a review process. And really, a new dietary ingredient notification should sort of capture the steps of the thought process, the information that was used by the notifier, by the manufacturer, to come to the conclusion that their product was, one, a dietary supplement, two, that it was safe, and in order to enter it into the market. So it really is the notifier's story in this case. So hopefully I've explained a little bit what a dietary ingredient is. The concept of a new dietary ingredient gets a little bit more complicated. So I want to go into that a little bit here. So a new dietary ingredient really deals with when a product or an ingredient was marketed, whether it's present in the food supply, and whether it has been chemically altered. So if an ingredient was marketed prior to 1994, which was when DSHEA was enacted, it's not a new dietary ingredient and an NDI is not required. If a dietary ingredient was not marketed, but was present in the food supply, then it is a new dietary ingredient, but whether it was chemically altered or not determines whether a notification is needed. So if it's not been chemically altered, then a notification is not needed. If it has been chemically altered during the manufacture or the extraction process, then a notification is needed. And then finally, if an ingredient was not marketed and was not present in the food supply as an article used for food prior to 1994, then it is both an NDI and is a requirement of to have a notification submitted. Going to back up just a little bit. I skipped over by mistake. I want to touch quickly on the requirements for a pre-market notification. You can see here that this is what's captured in 21 CFR 190.6. They're not extensive in the sense of there's not a large number of them, and these are the only true requirements. So again, 75 days prior entering market, very basic information such as the name and address of the manufacturer or the distributor. We need the name of the dietary ingredient, and we need a description of this. So the identity, along with the level of the ingredient and the condition of use. And then perhaps most importantly is the history of use or other evidence of safety. And for dietary supplements, the safety bar is reasonably expected to be safe. And then just as a note, 21 CFR lays out that the notification, a redacted notification, and the FDA's response to that notification will be made public after the 90th day. So I'm going to focus a little bit on this description. Again, this is fairly straightforward, but is often supported by a great deal of information. So first, looking at identity and manufacturing, and I think these things are linked very closely because it's not just about the identity of the product today, but it's the identity of the product tomorrow or a year from now, sort of moving off. What systems have been put in place to make sure that the product today and the product a year from now are the same product. So when it comes to probiotics, again, the identity includes a taxonomic classification of the microorganism and the strain. And again, our ingredients are, we're linked to the strain, whether it's a dietary ingredient, whether it has been used in the food before, even those dates. It's about strain and not species. The method used, tell us about the method you used in order to do this identity. There are some examples there, but any method that's been used is necessary. These are not requirements. These are part of our guidance document. Again, percent similarity with the type of, and a reference strain to the same species, if that is available, that's really useful information. And when it gets to the manufacturing, we want to, again, understand the quality of the finished product. So what specifications are in place, what quality control steps, procedures, control points have been put in place. And tell us about those methods that have been used to quantify the ingredient, as well as methods that are used to make sure that other contaminants, including other harmful pathogens, haven't entered into the system or into the product. Then we get into sort of a characterization and safety. And generally with supplements, there is a history of use that can be used as safety, but if there's not an extensive history of use, there are other evidence of safeties that should be talked about. Clearly, we are interested in antibiotic resistance, which is of great importance. And so understanding the antibiotic resistance, understanding the pathogenicity, the biogenic amines, the productions of mucinase. We'd say also if the safety of the microbial ingredient is based on similar other strains that are in the market, then a detailed analysis of how this ingredient and those ingredients relate is really important. When it gets to sort of history of use or other safety, some of this depends on the relation intended for the product. So if the history of use and the intended intake are very similar, very often that history, there's less detail that needs to be added. Where if the current intake and the history of use are very offset or very different, additional testing or other evidence of safety may be necessary. Again, this is really the story that needs to be told by the notifier. Explain how they came to their determination of safety and explain that sort of to the FDA. So I mentioned previously response letters. So while this is not an approval, the FDA does respond to new dietary ingredient notifications, and there are different ways that we can respond. The incomplete is generally given if something specific in 190.6 isn't provided, and after our outreach to the notifier can't be provided. So, for example, if they didn't provide an address, they would end up with an incomplete. That's a requirement of 190.6 and something we have to have. Or if they didn't translate the information, that may end up in an incomplete. So that's very much an administrative letter. There's an acknowledgement without objections, which are often referred to as good day letters, simply saying that we've reviewed the notification and have no objections. There are at times objection letters raising some safety concerns. If the safety determination, we still have concerns over that, we will issue that in a letter. And then there are other regulatory issues. So for example, if We felt that the notifier had not established that the product was, or the ingredient was actually a dietary ingredient. That's something that we would issue with the letter. And I will say, if something is not a dietary ingredient or a supplement, we do not follow through with a safety evaluation. And partly that's because if we don't know what the product is, we can't apply the correct safety standard. And I would say that much of this is a back and forth. So if we get the notification and there's something missing, we will send out a request for more information to try to get some clarity. So it's not as simple as submit it to us if we review it and magically 75 days later we give a response. There's often a back and forth during the process. And again, that redacted notification, so any confidential business information is removed, and our response letter are publicly available after the 90th day. So I just wanted to mention briefly as I close out some resources I think that are really useful in both helping understand how to put the notification together and also questions that are specific to probiotics, because they weren't captured in DSHEA specifically. And so sometimes there are nuances. One is the 2016 revised draft guidance. Again, this is a guidance document, so it's FDA's current thinking, but it's not a requirement. That's set up as a question and answer document and really quite useful in taking through all of the steps, and does cover bacteria and other live microbials as well. Additionally, there's what we call a pre-NDIN meeting, so a meeting prior to submission and notification. In these meetings, we can answer questions about the process or about the potential notification. Often, notifiers will give us a presentation. We can comment on those and ask questions. What we can't tell you is whether you should or should not submit. Again, this is not an approval process, so that determination must be made by the manufacturer or the notifier. And then finally, unfortunately, we can't tell you the likely outcome of the review. We need all of the information in our hands before we can put forward a formal review. So hopefully with that, I've given you a rough idea of how supplements, especially, are, and where the authority comes from within the U.S., and really hopefully try to focus on some of that pre-market aspects and make it specific to probiotics because of the fact that they were not identified specifically in DSHEA. It's an approach that has been developed over the past 26, 27 years. And with that, thank you for your time.